Hi, and thanks for watching another instructional video for CSCI 1300. In this video, we're going to be talking about how to implement your project idea off of scratch paper. So there are two different design methodologies that we're going to talk about to get your idea off of paper and into your H-file implementations. The first methodology that we will talk about is called grouping variables. And the second that we will talk about involves listing aspects of the game that you need to represent. Both of these will lead to your class implementation. So let's start with the first. So if we're going to do grouping variables, what does this mean? Well, one approach that you can do to start a project is, if you have this idea of what you want to do, what you can do is you can list out a bunch of variables related to running the game, as many as you can think of. So you might have variables for keeping track of different things in the game, and you basically just want to brainstorm on all of the different possible variables that you could possibly use to represent all of the information in your game or your project. And as you go along, after you've listed a bunch of these variables, what you might notice is that you should start going through and choosing variables that are very similar to each other and grouping them together. So we're going to group these together because they are all related to some aspect of the game that we think we can turn into a class. So let's call this class 1 based on the variables that we have listed here that are more similar to each other than any of the other variables in the list. The next thing we'll do is we'll go through and see if we can find a second set that's completely different but is related to another aspect of the game. They all share something in some way. They all share some attribute about representing something in the game related to some aspect of the game that's different from what we have already defined in class 1. So that's going to be our class 2. And, we can keep going through this, and if we have additional variables that are related to each other, we can group these together and create another class as well. So this is the idea of grouping. We list out all of our possible variable options in a list, and then we sort those into collections. Those collections can then become some kind of a blueprint for how we should implement a class moving forward. So a couple of things that I can recommend that can help you with this, especially if you're doing remote work, would be to check out the Miro website. Miro is basically a giant shared sticky board. So if you're working with a project partner or you're working by yourself and you need to keep track of all of your ideas, say you want to take your ideas and leave little sticky notes and then start clustering them together, you could do something like this where you start putting them into groups and then figuring out how you're going to use those in your classes. Of course, regular sticky notes always work too. So now let's talk about the second methodology, which involves listing aspects of your game. So by aspects, we mean that basically you want to think about what you're going to have to do in the game that you'll have to keep track of. An example would be, say you have a game of chess and you have a board, and I know that this isn't a great chess board, but at some point you'll have squares that are different in some way you'll have to keep track of, so those might be locations. So one thing you can say is, okay, well, I probably have to keep track of that grid location. So what we can do is we can say that one of these locations times the whole thing Well, that's going to be some aspect of the game that we're going to have to represent. So we've got a collection of those locations stored together somewhere. So maybe we want to keep track of tiles on the board or locations. Well, we can do that by creating a class related to that. Now, say that we need to store, say, information related to like a pawn or, a king or something like that. We could create variables for the different pieces on the board. So the pieces of the board could become another class. So now we've got two different classes here related to this, and we might want to consider using another class to maybe run everything. So we might have another class called the board or something to keep track of maybe the stats or something in the game as we go through the game. So what we would do is we would basically say, like, we want to list some aspect. Maybe it's something to do with like the user information, maybe the stats of the user, or something related to playing with a character, or maybe it has to do with items. And we might say, like, okay, are those items generic items that everyone in the game can use at any given time, or is that something that's special? If it's a special item, then we definitely want to create a class from there and use those as maybe like a part of the game. So maybe we have weapons, or we have special power-ups or things like that that could become a class. If they're generic items, they might be related to running the game, or they might be something like an inventory or something like that, which we could create a class out of as well. Another thing to think about is maybe you have to keep track of parts of the game related to travel or updating information. Well, this could become a class as well. It's related to some aspect of the game that we could cluster enough variables together to make it a class on its own. So these are the two ways that we would do this. And once we define this series of aspects in the game, we would then go through and say, like, okay, if we're dealing with this class, we're going to start listing out all the possible variables to accomplish that aspect of the class, that aspect of the game. And we'll go through and do that for every single one of these. So each of the class will become basically a header that we will then create a list of variables under that header. So it's kind of like the reverse of what we've done previously over here with grouping variables into headers. So we either start with a list of the variables and pick and choose which ones are the most like and group them together, or we can come up with aspects of the game that we want to accomplish when running the game, and then come up with lists of variables that would be encapsulated within that aspect, or will be related to defining that in the game, that attribute or that part of the game. So that's all I've got for right now for working on paper to develop your ideas. I hope this was helpful. Thanks for watching, and happy coding.